And welcome in person to our first history group this year in person. And frankly, I'm saying this very quietly. God forbid my children would hear me, but I'm zoomed out. And I also feel like Rip Van Winkle, like where did the year go? Did all of you have all kinds of projects you were going to do? Mine lasted a week. The 21st, remember that date of June, Monday, here at the University Club. You just will not want to miss that program. If you're like me, wine is either red, white, or pink. Wouldn't that be nice to know what you're drinking? Or if you're really, really knowledgeable, we've got someone to help you even fill in the gaps of your expertise. Our next program should satisfy both situations. Ed Corey, certified wine educator, certified specialist of spirits, and a sherry wine and Bordeaux wine educator will guide us across the continents from, I am absolutely shaking. I've gotten out of shape here. Will guide us across the continents from 7,000 BCE to present to gain a better understanding of how wine was transformed from sacred to a consumer product costing thousands of dollars a bottle, which absolutely leaves me boggle-eyed, or a $3 chuck. That's my style. Now, I can't promise samples, but I can promise an interesting and great program. So, mark your calendars, the 21st, 10 o'clock, here at the club. No matter what the newspaper says, we're here. Finally, History Today, June the 7th, in 1864, Abe Lincoln was renominated for U.S. President by the Republican Party. In 1929, Vatican City became a sovereign state. And Dan, this is for you. In 1942, the Battle of Midway ended. Admiral Chester Nimitz won the first World War II Navy defeat of Japan. In 1946, the U.S. Supreme Court banned discrimination on the interstate travel. In 1965, the U.S. Supreme Court decided to legalize the use of contraceptive by married couples. In 1967, Israel captured the Wailing Wall, East Jerusalem, Jericho, and Bethlehem. In 1968, Sirhan Sirhan was indicted for assassination of the U.S. Senator Robert Kennedy. In 1972, the musical Grease opened in New York City for 3,388 performances. Wow. Here's another one. In 1993, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that religious groups could sometimes meet on school property after hours. Also, ground was broken for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and if you haven't seen it, go to it. It's in Cleveland. In 1995, the long-range Boeing 777 entered service for the United Airlines. And today is Tom Jones' 80th birthday. And also, yesterday was our history group's co-chairman, Ovid Vita's birthday. So, happy birthday, Ovid, and I'm giving you the mic.
Thank you, Sherry. Well, welcome everybody. It's been a year and a half, I think, since we had a last meeting here. It's good to see all of you. So, Lynn Schiffhorst. She grew up in Manhattan. She made many trips to the New York Public Library. That after taking so many books, they were thinking of charging her for her library card. She went to Catholic schools for 16 years, followed by graduate work in English at New York University. After teaching in Catholic high schools at Brooklyn College for 8 years, she moved to Florida. Lynn worked as a counselor for the state during the day, and in the evening she relocated to a coffee house in Winter Park, where she read European poetry and wrote her own poems. She married Jerry Schiffhorst in 1987 and then taught part-time at UCF. She also worked as a mental health counselor. Now, for 30 years, Lynn has lectured on literature, history, and art history for the Elder Hostel program, now called Rhodes Scholars. So we at the history group have been honored and delighted to listen to Lynn's lectures in the past several years. Those lectures such as they were sonnets before there was Shakespeare. Another one was about Florence Nightingale. She also spoke to us about the presidents of the Roaring Twenties, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. She also talked about Pope John the 23rd, the peacemaker of the world. And one of the last ones was about small men in big crisis, Presidents Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan. So her presentation today is titled, An Election and a Siege. Will the Capitol be attacked? Will the President-elect be killed? So on behalf of the History Group of the University Club, it's a great pleasure to present to you Lynn Schiffhorst. Lynn?
Well, thank you, Obed. That was a lovely introduction. I'm very grateful. And I was delighted that Sherry said today is the anniversary of Lincoln's renomination for the presidency in 1864, because I'm going to be saying something about him today. And when I was thinking about what to do for this program, obviously there were a lot of options. Certainly there's a lot to talk about today. but I thought that, as... What did I just do? Oh, okay. I always think it's me. The one thing that I thought really historically links up to the very tense election last year is the election of 1860. And there was a wonderful book that came out a few years ago called The Hour of Peril, The Secret Plot to Murder Lincoln Before the Civil War. And it opens with a wonderful picture, in a horrible way, but a necessary picture, of what the situation was like at the first inauguration of Lincoln on March 4th, because all presidents up until Franklin Roosevelt were inaugurated on the 4th of March, and then it was moved to January to shorten the anxiety of the lame duck who was left there, and even though he wasn't going to go into another term. But the picture that Daniel Stashower, gives in The Hour of Peril is something I don't think any of us would expect to see, even today. When Lincoln met up with Buchanan, as was tradition, James Buchanan was his predecessor, they got into a carriage and rode from the White House to the Capitol. But what did they see? Along the way to the Capitol, on every building along Pennsylvania Avenue, there was a sharpshooter poised. And every window in the Capitol had a gunman, federal gunman. When you looked at the Capitol from the outside, you saw not only that, you also saw artillery cannon on Capitol Hill. Because the man who was in charge of the Army, of the armed forces, General Winfield Scott, was somebody who was very well aware that there could be a great deal of violence, that the Capitol could be attacked, the Capitol could be blown up, anything could really happen. Because after the election of Lincoln in November of 1860, what happened, of course, was the beginning of the parade out of the Union by southern states, led off with South Carolina, almost immediately in the month after the election. And then, of course, other states would go as well. Florida was the third state out the door. And Mississippi, of course, as well. Alabama, Texas, Louisiana. It would end up being 7. Now, the capital of the Confederacy at this time was not Richmond, Virginia, which is what we all associate the capital with, but Montgomery, Alabama, because Virginia had not seceded yet. And so everybody was heading toward Montgomery. But what is interesting is that, what is amazing, really, is that a man like Lincoln, whose election triggered this outpouring of hatred and contempt and threats of violence, you could not have a gentler man. I don't think a gentler man ever ran for the office of president. And certainly this was not a man who commanded, a lot of power. I mean, Abe Lincoln, as we all know, was born in a log cabin. But his poor 25-year-old mother delivered him on a mattress of corn husks in a nest of bearskin rugs in a cabin that had a dirt floor and no windows. I mean, this was as dirt poor, literally, as you could get. And that was exactly how he grew up. His poor mother died when he was 9. She and a number of others died of what was called the milk sick, a fever that ran through the area in Kentucky where they were living. Fortunately, his father remarried a wonderful woman a year later, and Lincoln would call her the best friend I ever had in my life, Sally Johnston. And so she did one thing, well, she did many things for Lincoln, but one of the best things she did for him, apart from believing in him, from seeing who he was, she was devoted to him from the time that she married his father. And what she saw in him was somebody who had, he was different from everybody else. And he needed different kinds of permission growing up. And one of the permissions she was able to obtain for him from his father, and she said it was not easy. My husband was not easily reconciled to it, but she got permission for Lincoln to read. And everybody was supposed to, work from dawn to dusk, and Lincoln certainly did that. He grew up very strong. As you know, he ended up 6'4". And when he went to work cutting trees, people would think there were 3 people in there cutting trees. I mean, he was that, that energetic, and he put his mind to it, and he accomplished something. But what he really loved was reading, and there were very, very few books, as you can imagine. The schools that he went to were called blab schools, and I don't think anybody was more poorly educated formally than Lincoln, because he went to schools run by local people that basically relied on memorization and spitting it back to the teacher, but that is entirely bad. And certainly there were books, the Bible was available, Pilgrim's Progress was available, another classic of English literature, and every now and then something else would float in, like maybe part of the works of Shakespeare or quotations from Shakespeare. And Lincoln read every chance he could. Even when he was plowing, he would take a book along with him, and at the end of the furrow, he would let the horse rest, and he would whip out a book. So, it wasn't easy with 9 people living in a log cabin to be able to find time to read, but he somehow or another managed to do it. And later on in life, he would say that, his education was nothing. When he was running for office, not for president, but earlier than that, someone asked him about his background. And he said, he quoted a poem by Thomas Gray, Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard, that had been published in the 1750s, so 100 years before he was asked that question. He said, my background, the short and simple annals of the poor. And he said, I've never had a wealthy relative or a popular relative, or anybody who could do anything for me beyond what I could do for myself. He said, if I am elected, I will work hard at this job. He said, if I'm not elected, I will just go back to doing what I've been doing, and I'll work hard at that. He was always just very basic, very understated, very low-key, but very intelligent and very centered on what was the principle involved in any interaction that he had. So even though he did, as he said, have no influential friends, nevertheless, he was a likable person. And he seems to have been one of those people that, when I was working as a counselor, I used to say to some people who felt that they had absolutely, nothing in common with the people they grew up with, and those numbers are greater than you might think. I would say, listening to them, and I could hear how they were, how they always went toward what was best for everybody. And I would say, well, you're God's child, you know. And certainly Lincoln was God's child. He was one of those people who grew up on the frontier with no vices. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He didn't gamble. He didn't fight. He didn't go hunting. When he was a little boy, maybe around 9 or 10, he saw a wild turkey coming toward his father's cabin. He picked up a gun and shot it. And of course, he hit it, and the bird bled. And that was the end of his shooting. Oh. And this is the man who would grow up to preside over the largest bloodbath in American history. But he was just the kind of person that other people instinctively trusted. Interestingly enough, he has that in common with Washington. Because when Washington was growing up, he was in better circumstances. But nevertheless, people always knew they could trust him. And you know that he would do what he said. He was reliable. So, but Lincoln he wanted out of the backwoods in the worst possible way. And one day, when he was on the river, he was asked by two businessmen if he would carry them in his boat to a steamboat that was going down south, maybe down to New Orleans. And so he said, sure. So he took them in his boat, and when they got on the steamboat, they turned around, and each one of them flipped a $50 into his boat, a silver $50. He picked it up. He looked at it. This was like the Holy Grail. He had a chance to get out of what he was doing. And later on, when he was in the White House, he talked about that moment when he got his silver dollars as the most important development in his youth, because he realized it was a way out. Now, of course, his reading and his studying were also ways out. But even when he broke with his father and went to work at a little, dry goods store where he was living originally, of course, in Kentucky. His father moved to Indiana and then moved to Illinois. And when he was in Illinois, he found a way to work, Indiana too, to work in a store. And even when he was working in the store, he had a book. And if there were no customers, he just whipped out the book and began reading. And so he realized also that the way to a better job really was to learn how to be a lawyer, because lawyers knew a lot. And they were very influential people in their state. And he had the idea that a lot needed to be done for the state. Lincoln was always about more than himself. I forgot to say, and I should have said, that he was also an animal lover. You know, we don't associate him with having dogs at the White House, but he was an animal lover. He was good to animals. And he could not stand to see anybody torturing an animal. Apparently, one of the fun things that people did, boys did when they were young, was put hot coals on the back of a passing turtle. And I mean, it's the kind of thing that happens. And so, he was always the one to get the coals off the turtle and say, they suffer pain. And he told the story one time when he was in a hurry going somewhere, and he passed a hog that was caught in a mire, in a marsh, and it was going down, and he didn't have time, so he passed it. And then he said, he thought to himself, that hog is looking at the back of me, thinking, there goes my last hope. And so he turned around and he went back and he extricated the hog from the marsh before he went on his business. So what is there not to like about this man? And yet he would be the most hated presidential candidate, in the history of the United States up until that time. But nevertheless, he went on to work. He didn't, of course, go to law school. There were very few law schools. You studied under somebody who'd already been licensed to the bar, and then you passed a test and you were licensed, and he was. And that was, of course, how he got his start. But he wanted to do something more. He wanted to do something for the local people. And so he ran for office. He served in the state legislature in Illinois. He had one term in the National Congress in Washington. But basically, what he wanted to do was what today we would call infrastructure. That was his big concern. He wanted to see the rivers cleaned out so that heavier ships could go through. He wanted to see the roads cared for so that there could be more business, so that everybody didn't have to kill themselves, working to build houses on their own, clear forests on their own, and have nothing to look forward to from dawn to dusk but more work on the next day. So he joined the party that at the time was called the Whig Party, even though everybody around him was a Democrat. They were all Andrew Jackson Democrats. Jackson was looked on as the common man. And so a lot of people who were common men, voted for him. or at least supported the people who came after him and lived in his spirit, so to speak. But Lincoln didn't. And when everybody else went to church, Lincoln didn't. He never did what other people did, but he did what he felt was the right thing to do. So he joined the Whig Party, which was the forerunner of the Republican Party. Whig, W-H-I-G, is the name that was given to the American Party based on the British party that was considered to be His Majesty's or Her Majesty's loyal opposition. It was the opposition party in Britain. The Tories, of course, were the ones who were in. So, that was his concern. And when everybody else was backing Andrew Jackson, he backed Henry Clay. Jackson's famous statement, of course, is, "I only regret on leaving the presidency that I wasn't able to shoot Henry Clay and hang John C. Calhoun." Well, I would vote for him killing John C. Calhoun. I think man deserved to be killed if anybody did. But, at any rate, that's what he said. So Lincoln went on to do his best. He became famous, really, in the debates with Stephen Douglas. Now, Douglas was already very famous. He's also from Illinois. He represented Illinois. He was actually from Vermont. Grew up in upstate New York, and then made his way, when he was about 20, west, felt that there were more opportunities there and settled in Illinois. But, we tend to think sometimes very simplistically that if you're from the South, you're pro-slavery. If you're from the North, you're anti-slavery. A lot of people who were very much about themselves and very much about business were very much pro-slavery because it was bringing a heck of a lot of money into the country. And so Douglas, who was, from the area that was, noted for its abolitionists, saw nothing wrong with slavery. I mean, he really, it was fine with him. It brought in a heck of a lot of money, and it certainly did. I will intervene at this point just to say a little something about slavery because it's an enormous issue at this time. And it was, when we went to school, we learned that the war was about states' rights. Didn't we? I mean, I certainly did. The Civil War was about states' rights. Well, yes, if you want to say it that way, but it was about the right of states to enslave people so that they could make a bundle of money. The war was about money, as it so often is. And the cotton plantations were coining money. Millions of people were enslaved. After all, they were owned, body and soul. They had to produce, and they produced more and more and more as the 1800s went on. Every decade, the enslaved people produced more and more cotton. How did they do it? Under the threat of torture, which was always ratcheted up. In a factory, if the factory workers are producing more and more, it usually means that the machinery is much improved. There was no machinery in the cotton fields. It was entirely done by hand, and it was entirely done in a reign of terror. By the 1860s, cotton, which was the world's leading commodity, and the African Americans were producing the overwhelming majority of it, but the cotton was bringing home to the plantation owners in 1860 a total of $2 billion. That is the money of 1860. That is not adjusted to today. The richest states in the Union were South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and what one did I leave out? Georgia. And it was all done on the bleeding backs of African Americans. So, the people who were in charge, of course, were determined to keep this money rolling in. Lincoln told a wonderful story, and very simple. He always had stories to tell. And he said, that money, his message, of course, was that, money changes everything. It changes people's ability even to see what's in front of them. He tells the story of two ministers. One opened a Bible and said to the other one, do you see this word right here? And the man said, yes. Then he took a gold coin and he put it over the word. He said, do you see it now? If there's money there, people cannot see anything wrong with what brings them in money. And so the real motivation for the Civil War is what we learned in Latin class. If any of you took Latin, the old Latin phrase, radix malorum est cupiditas. Greed is the root of all evil. And the greed was there. There's a tendency to think that, that the Confederacy was a plucky little organization, David going up against Goliath. The people who ran the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, and the others, were fat cats. They were the 1% of their time. And they had, the Confederacy had as much in its treasury as some European countries. So they were not short of money, and they were not little. But they were determined that the abolitionists would not have their way. And Lincoln, of course, was called, in the simplest terms that I can repeat here, a damned abolitionist. Oddly enough, he really wasn't, certainly not in the beginning, because he's associated with the Emancipation Proclamation during the war. We tend to think he was. But he had a determination to stick to the Constitution and what the Constitution allowed. And the Constitution does allow for slavery. Slavery is never mentioned by name in the Constitution because probably the founders were embarrassed by all their, shouting about liberty and freedom and all the rest of this. And then to talk about people who had none really didn't go along with the philosophy. So it's in there, but it's not mentioned. The word slavery is not used. But when Lincoln began to tackle Douglas, and Stephen Douglas wanted nothing to do with debates against Lincoln. Douglas was everything. Lincoln was this hick, lawyer from Illinois. Why would he, want to debate him and raise his profile? So Douglas refused initially. Basically, he said, get lost. But what Lincoln did was trail Douglas around on the circuit. And Douglas would give a talk in the afternoon, Lincoln would give a talk in the evening in the same place. So finally, Douglas decided, all right, we'll have some face-to-face debates. And what were the debates about? Well, for the men who were debating, it was about winning a seat in the Senate in Washington. But Lincoln really wanted it, of course. He could see which way the country was going. He knew that people who were principled were much needed, and the pro-slavery forces were getting set to take over. Unfortunately, at this time, the president was James Buchanan. And Buchanan is if Lincoln is somebody that everybody has to like when you know him, I would think Buchanan was somebody that would be hard to like when you knew him. But even though he was from Pennsylvania, he was the oldest president. He was born in the 1790s to a middle-class family, although middle class wasn't a term used in the colonies, in the early country. But I think if you could look into Buchanan's heart, you would see a dollar sign there. He spent his life as an attorney and working for the government. In fact, by the time he ran for office in 1856, his nickname was Old Public Functionary. He was like the old shoe. He had served 10 presidents, starting with James Monroe. But he's another one who could see nothing wrong with slavery. In fact, he rather liked it. He just wanted the abolitionists to shut up. And so he did everything possible to promote the Southern point of view. As a little side note, I should say that he's the only president who never married. And he spent a lot of time with William King, who was the senator from Alabama, and they were known collectively as Mr. Buchanan and his wife. So you make what you want out of that. I don't know. But at any rate, he every chance he could, he promoted the Southern point of view. And so when everybody knew that the Dred Scott decision, which you probably remember from high school or college, was coming up, Dred Scott was an enslaved man who sued for his freedom because his owner, an army doctor, had taken him into free states. And so he didn't see why, in that case, he didn't have the right to be free. He sued in a court in Missouri, and the court found for him and said he was right. An appeals court reversed that decision. And then, of course, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And Buchanan, knowing that this was coming, that a big decision was coming, wrote to one of the Supreme Court justices and said, look, why don't you come up with something that will just end this whole business about slavery? So they did. And basically they said that no black person has any rights that a white person is obliged to recognize. Black people can never be citizens. This is sort of what it was. So Lincoln had a lot to say about that. He was not an abolitionist in the sense of wanting to free the slaves from where they were, but he did not like the attitude that was being promoted. And he said, among other things, that when we started this country, He said, in the Declaration of Independence, we said all men are created equal. He said, now we say all men are created equal except Negroes. He said, if the know-nothings, this was the anti-immigrant party, gets their way, and if they get in, he said, we're going to have, in the Declaration of Independence, a little rewriting that says all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics. So he said, I'm not joining any group that degrades a class of white people. Enough problems degrading a class of black people. So his willingness to say things like that gave the people who were running the Southern governments a sense that he was not their friend. And so there was a lot of talk that Lincoln, might be elected. But in the election of 1860, he was running against 3 other people. Most of us, if we have some vague recollection from our earlier years in school, think he was running against Stephen Douglas. He was Republican, and Stephen Douglas was a Democrat, because we think in terms of contemporary, but that was true. But there were also 2 other men involved. Buchanan's vice president, John Breckinridge, and he was actually second after Lincoln. He was a secessionist. He carried the southern states. And then there was John Bell, who was also a southerner from one of the border states. He carried the border states. And poor Stephen Douglas came limping in last at the end, which almost wouldn't have mattered because he only had about a year to live, although of course he didn't know that. But when Lincoln was running against Douglas for the presidency, Douglas did something that was really, he transcended his usual behavior, shall we say, instead of being completely self-centered. And he was quite when it comes to debate, one historian said he was the most formidable pugilist that ever existed in the US Congress. Meaning he could punch people so hard, with words, of course, that he would knock them down and then he would just go on over their prone bodies and he would continue, for another 2 hours. Whereas Lincoln, who just said very simple, straightforward things that were based on principle. But Douglas, running for presidency, did something terrible. He put down slavery, knowing that slavery was a divisive issue. And so what he took up instead was race. Because most white people were united on race. And he's basically saying, you don't want black people to be equal to you. You don't want black people voting for you. In Indiana, there was a parade of young girls, white girls, carrying signs that said, fathers, protect us from N husbands. So, I mean, there was this, they're going to marry with you. Oh, they're going to have the power. Oh, they're going to take over. All this. So, so that was not a very honest thing for Stephen Douglas to do. But at the end, when it looks like there was a good chance he was not going to win, he transcended himself and he went around and he said, look, we cannot secede. He went to Montgomery, Alabama, just a few days before the election in November of 1860. And he was brave to do it because he was promoting the Union and speaking against secession. And where is he? Montgomery, Alabama, the heart of the future capital of the Confederacy. Interestingly enough, John Wilkes Booth was in the audience at the time because he was an actor and he was there for a theater performance. He was a ham actor. It wasn't very good. His brother was the leading American actor, his older brother, and their father had been the leading American actor of his time. But John Wilkes was not quite up to their standard. However, at this point, he was not a fanatic. But they all listened to Stephen Douglas, and what he said was very sensible. He pointed to Montgomery, Alabama, that was a very elegant-looking town. There were only about 10,000 people in Montgomery, and half of them were enslaved to the other half. But money was pouring in, and the State House, very elegant. The homes along the main street, Italianate homes. And very elegant hotels so the businessmen could meet there. And then they were down at the wharf. There were very big warehouses, fireproofed, of course, because there were 1 million bales of cotton sitting there ready to, bring in the money. And he said, Stephen Douglas said, look around you. He said, this is a wonderful place. You've got everything you could possibly want. He said, do you know what's going to happen if you go to war? And then he described to them what was going to happen. He could have said it very simply by using a proverb that I saw in the paper just last week. It's from India, but it's a wonderful statement. and it says, it captures something. And in India, people say, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. Now that is profound when you think about that. And what he was really saying to the people of Montgomery, Alabama, it's the ground, you are the ground, you are the grass, you're the ones who are going to suffer. So he did a good job, and one of them is recorded, one man is recorded as having left there, said, well, I guess if Lincoln's elected, I can stand it for another 4 years. But of course, that is not what was going to happen. There were enough hotheads who were making sure that was not going to happen. And Lincoln had done something which really promoted his candidacy. After all, he was basically nobody. And he was in, a number of people were interested in the fact that a number of very important people, Horace Greeley, for example, a big newspaper man, William Cullen Bryant, another big newspaper man, poet, but big in the newspaper business. And Cullen Bryant invited Lincoln to come to New York and give a talk to all the influential people he could gather, and it's called Lincoln's Cooper Union Speech. And after he was nominated by the Republican Party, and his friends had managed to get the convention moved to Chicago, I wonder why they did that. So, it was much easier to nominate Lincoln from that point of view. All his friends were around. But he went to the place called Cooper Union, and he gave a talk. And this man, who was famous for his jokes, and for just his way of diffusing situations with sweetness, gave a talk. He looked so unimpressive. Lincoln always looked unimpressive. He always looked like something the cat dragged in, except that, he was a pretty tall cat. So, I don't know. But he gave a talk that was an amazing production for the time, because he said, Stephen Douglas and the others who support him say that the founding fathers did not believe that Congress had any right to legislate about slavery. In other words, people should be free to do whatever they want to do in their own states. He said, is that true? So what he did was take the statements of the founding fathers, and he identified the founding fathers very clearly on by which ones signed the Constitution in 1787. There were 39 representatives who signed the Constitution. And he took a look at what each one of those had to say and actually did after they signed the Constitution about slavery, whether it was slavery in the Northwest Territory, whether it was slavery anywhere. And he went through each one of the 39 names, plus the more famous ones, of course, Lincoln, Hamilton, the others. And by the end, he showed that, oh yes, they certainly did think, they knew that Congress had every right to legislate for slavery, and in fact, they saw it as a practice to be restricted and not a right to be licensed. Well, he got a standing ovation. The people, one woman was reported as having said as she collapsed on the way out, he's the greatest man since St. Paul. So he didn't have much of a voice, he didn't have much of a look, but my God, could that man think. And he spoke from his heart, but his heart was connected to his head. And, and he did the research. He couldn't surf the web. That spent, long hours in libraries reading to find out the information that he got. And so he finally, he did it. And he really inspired people. So he ended up, of course, winning the election. Now, he didn't win by much. He didn't, do you know what percentage of the popular vote he got?
30.
Yeah, 39.9 to be exact, according to this man, or 38. But he did a lot better, of course, than anybody else. But he had to wait for the electoral ballots to be counted. And he really won because he won in the Electoral College. He didn't win. He didn't win because he carried the majority of the popular votes. But what happened, of course, after Lincoln is elected, South Carolina leaves immediately or almost immediately, and then the others begin to go out the door. And so there is some concern that something might happen in Washington, or something might happen to Lincoln to prevent his being inaugurated. Well, Lincoln makes his plans to go to the inauguration. He's in Illinois, of course, in Springfield. And he makes his plan to go throughout the northern states, all the people who had voted for him. He felt they deserved a chance to see the man they had voted for. And so he made his plans to go through from Illinois to take the trains. There were 18 different lines he had to be on. The look of, if you set up the look of the railroads in Lincoln's time, it looks like a monopoly board with so many owned by everybody else. And he was going to stop, of course, first in Indianapolis, then go on to Ohio, and then go on to upstate New York. His first stop in New York was a little nothing of a place where a little girl called Grace Bedell lived. And Grace Bedell had written to him and said, I think, Mr. Lincoln, I think you should have a beard. Lots of men have beards, and it would make your face look better. So he did. He did. He wrote back to her. He got the letter, and he wrote back to her. And when he was coming through upstate New York, he stopped and he said, is she here? And they passed her along to him, and he gave her a kiss and said, as you can see, I took your suggestion, and I now have a beard. So he was a charmer, of course, in a wonderful way. He had pretty much a basic system for every place that he was at, that where he did not get off, it was just a train stop, a whistle stop, and of course, huge crowds of people came around him. But, he would kiss a little girl, he would bless an old man, he would wave to an old friend, he would say a few words and then say, well, gotta get on my way, and then he'd be gone. But during this time, just before he leaves on February 11th, and he needed to get to Washington, of course, much earlier than March 4th. But his real concern was not what was going to happen on March 4th. His real concern was what was going to happen on February 13th, when the electoral ballots were counted. That was where he thought was going to be the problem. And William Seward, who had lost the nomination to Lincoln, but he had a great regard for Lincoln, and he accepted the situation. He was a former governor of New York, and at that time a senator. He said, I'm very worried. He said, I think you need to change your plans, change your travel plans, and get here earlier than you expect. And Lincoln said, he said, I want you here, way before the 4th. And he said, I can't do that. He said, but the real issue is going to be February 13th, the counting of the ballots. He was afraid that the House might decline to meet, or there wouldn't be a quorum, or that somebody would blow something up. You never know what could go on. But that was his January 6th, of course. Since we do everything much earlier now. The inauguration is January 21st. The electoral ballot is counted in January. Then it was counted February 13th. But he felt that he needed to stick to the system that he had. He needed to show that he was unafraid, and he basically was not afraid. He was a fearless man. But something had happened in the offices of a man who owned one of the railroads that Lincoln would be traveling on. And in late January, there's a knock at the door. Mr. Samuel Felton, who owns the railroad, gets up, and a woman comes in that he recognized because people knew her from a picture in the paper. And her name was Dorothea Dix. And Dorothea Dix was somebody who was a reformer in the area of mental illness. She would travel up and down the East Coast trying to improve the situation of people who were considered insane and therefore either locked up like prisoners or treated like animals in the zoo, put where anybody could come and look at their weird behavior. And she was trying to make improvements. But she said to Mr. Felton, she said, I want to tell you, I've been traveling through the South for a long time, and there is definitely a conspiracy to make sure that Lincoln never gets to Washington for the inauguration. And then she put everything out in front of him, because people weren't paying attention when she was around, or weren't paying attention to her. They were talking freely. Women didn't matter. There she was. But she took down notes, and she knew better than to go to Washington. She didn't think anybody would listen. But she went to a railroad owner and knew that if she told him his railroad was likely to be blown up, he would listen. And so he did. And when she finished, he got up, he said, thank you. So after she left, he got in contact with a detective whom he had used before, and other people who owned railroads had used this man before, with the name of Alan Pinkerton. Probably a lot of you know from Pinkerton's detective agency that went on for quite some time. I didn't think to look it up to see if it's still in existence. But he's an interesting man, born in Scotland, in the slums of Glasgow, joined the working men's movement, got his name in trouble with the police, decided it was best to come to this country, and married his 15-year-old girlfriend when he was 20, and brought her over here, set up shop in an area just west of Chicago with a wonderful Scottish name of Dundee, and he was a barrel maker. But one day when he was out looking for wood for his barrels, he found a setup in an island where he used to get the very good wood. And he looked at the tools, and there was something about that made him think he had stumbled on a nest of counterfeiters. And so he went back and he told the sheriff, and that was how he got to know the sheriff. And gradually, people came to rely on him and the sheriff's department and use him when they thought that there was something fishy going on. So he ends up as the chief official detective in Chicago. He puts together his own detective bureau, and this man was super serious about it. He regarded it as a calling. It was not a job, it was a vocation. And in his home, and he was, I should also say, he was a big supporter of the Underground Railroad. His home in Chicago was one of the stops along the Underground Railroad. So, you know, he worked hard in a lot of ways. He had he had a wardrobe that looked like the wardrobe of a theater, because he knew that anybody he hired was going to have to fit in with the people that they were spying on. And so, you know, they had to look exactly right. One of the most interesting people who showed up at his door one day, this is about 2 years before the 1860, was a woman. And he looked at her, she said, I'm here for a job. And he said, I'm sorry, I don't have anything for you. You know, no secretary, no clerk. She said, I don't think you understand me. She said, I'm here to work as a detective. No, he says. And he begins to think, you know, the last request he got for detective said, can you send me some guy who's half horse, half alligator? Because I need him to be at home in the backwoods and also know how to operate on the river. And so he thinks, I can't send this widow. She was 23 years old, lovely woman, you know, out on a job. And she said, I want you to, let me tell you why I think you should hire me. She said, a lot of times people will, criminals will be very good at keeping their criminal activities secret from everybody except their wife, their sister, their girlfriend. Them, they'll tell the truth to. She said, don't you think it would be helpful to have somebody who became a confidant of that poor wife, sister, girlfriend, and if somebody that wife, sister, or girlfriend could rely on, who could tell the truth to, because after all, they're carrying a lot in their hearts. And the next day he went back and thought, she's right. So he hired her. And Kate Warren was her name, and there are several biographies of her now. I looked her up on Amazon. There's even children's biographies of Kate Warren, because she was terrific, and she knew exactly what she had to do. She was from New York State, but very often, of course, in his employment, she had to pose as a Southern lady. And apparently she had everything down pat. She knew exactly what she was doing. So he will call on her during the time to protect Lincoln. But what he realizes that one thing Lincoln needs to do really is change his routine, but Lincoln will not. He feels that these people need to see him, and they voted for him. It's only right to do, so he's going to do it. Well, his Pinkerton spies, who are centered mostly in Baltimore, because Baltimore is the hot spot. Baltimore was famous for the nickname Mob Town. And it was called that because, you know, they were, for obvious reasons, let me say no more, and the streets would run with blood, and it was, you know, it had some very fine things in it, but it also had some awful things in it. And the feeling seemed to be strongest there. If there was a pulse of hatred that you could identify anywhere, it was in Baltimore. And yet Lincoln had to go through Baltimore on his way to Washington. There was really no other way to get there if you're going by train. So Pinkerton puts out his spies, he does everything possible, and he finds out through one of his spies, a former Jesuit seminarian. He got people from everywhere. The Jesuits are a religious order in the Catholic Church, and the current Pope is a Jesuit. But this man was in the Jesuits and left, and he joined Pinkerton's organization. And another man who was a descendant of one of the families on the Mayflower belonged there. So they were all active in Baltimore. Kate is there with the women in Baltimore. And they find out that the real center of the real organizing brain behind the plot to either blow up the train or at this point, or basically kill Lincoln, the center of it is a man who works as a barber in one of the hotels in Baltimore, and who is Italian, Cipriano Ferrandini. He's an Italian anarchist who was very active in killing people in Italy, And so he comes over here and he is determined to stand up for Southern rights. Now he is nobody. You know, he is, in a way, he's almost the demonic opposite of Lincoln. Lincoln is nobody too. But Lincoln, you know, of course, is an angel on the inside. This man is somebody else. But he has great strength of character. I mean, he can, if you to misuse the term character a little bit, but he has, you know, he has the ability to get people who far rank above him socially to listen to him and respect him. So Pinkerton finds out through his associates that the plan is that Ferrandini has put together an organization of a small group of men who are going to assassinate Lincoln when Lincoln is forced to change trains in Baltimore. Baltimore is the center of 3 rail lines. The last train Lincoln will be on will come from Harrisburg. I'm sorry, from Philadelphia. He makes a trip to Harrisburg, then Philadelphia, and then coming into Baltimore. But he has to change to get a different train to go down to Washington. And while he's changing trains, is this golden opportunity, because he's either going to be in a, this is what was common, a sleeper train that would be uncoupled, and then put on a horse-drawn wagon and carried to the next depot, which was a mile down the road. Or he was going to have to get out, walk, and then get into an open carriage. And either way, they thought Ferrandini was prepared for him to be in an open carriage. He had a group of men that all swore an oath, you know, to stand up for Southern rights. And one night, shortly before Lincoln is due to pass through, Ferrandini comes out with a box that has ballots in it, little pieces of paper. One of them is marked red, he tells them. And whoever pulls that ballot out, he is the one who is going to actually do the deed to assassinate Lincoln with a knife. So Pinkerton's operative says, who has, you know, wiggled his way into this group, says to the man who is his target, I don't know about this. You know, this guy could decide he doesn't want to do it at the end, or he just gets cold feet. And the man says, don't worry. He said, there's a lot more than one ballot in there marked red. So Pinkerton's operative says, great. So he goes back and tells Pinkerton. So Pinkerton, somehow or another, there's a lot of coming and going on trains, back and forth, trying to get the message to Lincoln and keep him up to date. Lincoln is totally unwilling to change his plans, and he's been asked. He's in Philadelphia at the point when they, you know, tell him about the plans to assassinate him. And the following morning in Philadelphia, he is due to raise the flag at Independence Hall, and then go on to Harrisburg to give a talk to their General Assembly. And he says, I have to do that. He listens to it. He says, no, I have to do that. Seward, who has also had his feelers out, finds out from somebody else that Lincoln is going to be assassinated. He sends his son up to tell Lincoln. So after Lincoln listens to Pinkerton and his men, he goes aside to try to sleep. And Fred Seward is knocking on the door, and he's got this news. So Lincoln says, well, I can't change it now. He said, there's something wrong about ducking out on a raising of the flag at Independence Hall. You just can't do that. So he decides that what he will do is, when he is in Harrisburg, he will leave Harrisburg and he will go directly to Baltimore, to Washington. And he will take a different train. But of course, it all has to be kept super secret. The most fatal thing is to have a leak, because then the plotters will change their plans. And then they will know, what is going to happen. So they do decide that. The governor of Pennsylvania is told. He's in Harrisburg, of course, and he's a Republican. He admires Lincoln, and Lincoln said, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to leave in your carriage. He said, but I'm not going to your executive mansion. He said, I'm going to the train depot. So the man says, that's fine. So he has to go in disguise. Lincoln is not an easy person to disguise. And so he is given, instead of his stovepipe hat, which everybody of any significance wore, I'll take a minute to just say, the stovepipe hat resided upside down in Lincoln's office when he was just an attorney. And if he didn't know what to do with some papers, because he was never organized, he would just throw them into the top of the stovepipe. That was it. But at this point, he had to have a soft hat, he had to wear a cloak, he had to stoop down like somebody who was not well, and he was, and he was put in a special train that the owner of the railroad had arranged for. And so he is carried taken into Philadelphia, where he's going to pick up the train to Baltimore. Unfortunately, the men running the train have worked so hard they get him in too fast to Philadelphia. And the train isn't going to leave for another hour. So Pinkerton decides he's going to have to ride around the city in an open carriage, in disguise, of course. And so that is exactly what they do, because he can't walk out there. But it is night, and that's a help. Meantime, Kate is with the train in Philadelphia, and she's been told to hold the sleeper for Lincoln. Well, this is very hard to do, because the railroad company has a rule that if there's nobody taking that booth, you can have it. So she goes out and she speaks to one of the porters. She's very persuasive, and she says, and she's young, of course, and lovely, and she says, "Could you help me?" The helpless female routine. "Could you help me?" And she also has a little money to slip into his pocket. "My brother is coming. He's an invalid, and he really needs peace and quiet. Could he have the back of his sleeper? Can you keep people out of that?" So he says, "Sure, no problem." So that is actually what happened. So Lincoln is in the back of the sleeper with Kate, Pinkerton, and one other person, and from his entourage, and they end up in Baltimore. And then, of course, they are taken. This is also, very early in the morning. They're taken to the train, and the train carries him into Washington. And so he gets there safely. But when the news arrives that through Willard Hotel is practically the center of Washington. Forget the White House, forget, the Capitol. Willard Hotel is where everybody goes, and everybody stays, and everybody talks. And when the Southerners, who belong to the states that haven't seceded yet, but will, hear that he is there, they say, "My God, what went wrong in Baltimore?" And they can't believe it. So, he got there. But I think, his willingness to face ridicule, because he was ridiculed for it, for being a coward. And one person who did not ridicule him and said just the perfect thing was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had escaped slavery, and had taken a train north, and got out, and about 15 years earlier had written a book, his autobiography, and he said Lincoln only did what many another brave man has done. He escaped danger, and a certain danger, and that's really all he had to do. Just like the escaped slaves getting out. And so, but Lincoln had to put up with cartoons in the newspaper, showing him. It was said that he had a Scottish plaid shawl apparently, and somebody said he got out in a kilt, and of course the cartoons show him in a kilt dancing around. It's all crazy, ridiculous. But he got there. And the first thing he did, of course, was go and see Buchanan, who seemed very happy to see him. Buchanan was more than happy to get out of office, more than happy. He had always done so well. And when things go well for people all along, and suddenly things go terribly wrong, they don't rise to the occasion a lot of times. And all his friends had been Southerners when he was in the White House. Jefferson Davis was a good friend of his. Jefferson Davis had been Secretary of War under Buchanan's predecessor. So, no group who formed, another country, an enemy country, was ever as well informed about the country they planned to attack as the Confederacy, because they certainly knew it. But by the end, Buchanan couldn't keep a lid on things anymore. He had supported the pro-slavery forces in Kansas. Luckily, he did not win. Kansas came in as a free state. But he had supported, everything possible that could please the slaveholders, and yet they were not pleased. Lincoln said something at the conclusion of his Cooper Union speech that Buchanan could have thought about. He said, the Southern people, he said, they're not different from us. He said, but and he was always finding common ground. But he did say that, they say they want to be left alone. Well, we left them alone, but that didn't work. Then they wanted to have slavery everywhere. Well, after the Compromise of 1850, they got their slavery everywhere. And he said, but that didn't content them either. What they really want us to do is say that slavery is right. And we can't say that. We have to say it's wrong. And he said, and that is what is really, motivating them. That's what the motivating force is. So at some point, Buchanan begins to deteriorate physically. He develops a twitch in his cheek. He finds it hard to get out of bed. He's crying. He's meeting with the men from South Carolina who have already seceded. This was in January. They had seceded in in December. He had no business meeting with them. But he was trying to, sweet talk them, soft talk them into doing, holding off doing anything until he said, until Lincoln is in office. Now that's pretty low. I don't think you can go much lower than that. But what he should have said is, yes, you can come up and see me and I'll have you hanged. Because after all, they were traitors. They wanted him to hand over the Fort Sumter. But even Buchanan knew he could not do that. That was treason. To hand over a military fort in time of war was treason. Now, if he had been anything like Andrew Jackson, he could have done what Jackson did. I know we're short on time and I'm coming to a conclusion here. He could have done what Jackson did because South Carolina, during Jackson's administration, was also ready to secede. In their case, it was about anger over the tariff. The Congress had passed a tariff that put a high price on goods. They resented it, and John C. Calhoun said, we'll just obey the laws we want to obey. And you don't say that to Andrew Jackson. So what Jackson did, as they're all preparing, as the people in South Carolina are preparing to secede, and encouraging others in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia to join them in seceding, what Jackson does is send people into South Carolina to make sure, talk with the people who are Union supporters, and make sure that they are very strong. He reinforces all the federal forts there. He gets the Navy ready in Norfolk to attack the people in South Carolina. He gets Congress to pass a force bill that the Army can be let out against the people of South Carolina, and he will lead the Army. And all of a sudden, secession didn't look that good anymore. Because Andrew Jackson had quite a reputation. He won. He always won. And at that point, even though they hadn't heard that when two elephants fight, the grass suffers, they figured it out for themselves, in their own way. So he leaves, and so Buchanan is finally out of office, and Lincoln is in. And of course, I'll end with this wonderful statement that he makes at the very end of his inaugural address. He says, "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic chords of memory." It's a wonderful phrase. The mystic chords of memory. He's asking people to remember who we are. The mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this land, including the South, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. We can still pull together. When again touched, meaning the chords, when they are touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Somebody, one biographer said, Lincoln could have been a poet very easily, as he had a wonderful, wonderful way with words. So, okay, let me stop there and say thank you and give any questions.
Thank you. As always, you keep us thinking. I've got a question here.
Sure.
What about Mrs. Lincoln? Was she along with him?
Thank you. I forgot to say that. Yes, she was along with him until the very end. When the special train was arranged for Lincoln, she did not go. It was just Lincoln, Pinkerton, Kate, and one other person who was there like a bodyguard for Lincoln. She went on the train that he was expected to go on, but they stopped the train before Baltimore, and carriages were arranged to come and pick up her and the boys. And so she went into Baltimore differently. She didn't have to pass through Baltimore on the train either.
You mentioned that the war was about gold, about the value of the cotton crop. What happened after the Civil War to the cotton crop?
Well, I can't tell you immediately after, but I can tell you that it was a disaster, of course. I mean, the South was immediately plunged into poverty until they began to realize there was a way that the people who, were heartless and just wanted money, there was a way to reestablish slavery by another name. And the book that Mark Cooper first mentioned to me, Slavery by Another Name, is a wonderful story of an appalling event. How everything that black people could do was criminalized. You could be picked up for breathing while black, and you were thrown into labor camps. And so much of the prosperity of the South in the late 1800s was again built on the bleeding backs of African Americans.
We have another question.
Jan, yeah, there's a microphone right here.
Very good talk, Lynn, and I'm always amazed that you can go through this whole thing with no pauses and no notes, and when I just do it by heart. I have two questions. One, why were there so many candidates running? I assume they were each from a different party, and
Yes,
all
they
these
were.
parties, why couldn't the Democrats get their stuff together, you know, and really unite as one party? And the second question is, you know, when the Confederacy started, they were very well organized from the very beginning.
They were indeed.
You know, they had a constitution, they had, you know,
Yeah. They were
a president.
They had the Boy Scout motto, be prepared. They were.
Yeah, and, you know, this whole thing organized, what states were going to secede and join this and the whole works. How many years had this been in the planning stage?
Well, if you think that the initial one under John C. Calhoun was the 1830s, then you would say 25 years, you know, that they had been talk about it. I think there's always a fear with people who are, you know, operating a dodgy operation that somebody's going to come along and stop them. And that's, I mean, you know, they were earning so much money that they couldn't imagine not earning all that money. So they were, you know, they joined together. But why the Democrats could not get their act together is very simple. Stephen Douglas, they saw as a traitor. After years of talking about slavery and, you know, and being pro-slavery, he turned out to be pro-union. He was against secession. And so the Southern Democrats simply would not back him. And they backed Buchanan's vice president, who was a Southerner, Breckinridge. And then along comes hopping John Bell from the border states that felt differently from both the southern states and the northern states. And so they backed John Bell. Lincoln won because, of course, the North had a larger population than the South. But, you know, Breckinridge was second. Bell was third. He carried all the border states. His party was called the Constitution and Union Party. And they just made up a name, I think. And then along came Stephen Douglas. I think he only got if I'm not mistaken, I think he only got the electoral ballots from 2 states. New Jersey and California. That was all. But we always think about him.
Was Breckinridge that well known or that popular?
He was not well known in himself, but I mean, he was, you know, after all, he was, you know, vice president to Buchanan, and so that gave him a cachet that nobody else had. And he was, you know, he was useful. He went on, of course, to secede. He became a Confederate general, and I think he also, for a time, served in the Confederate cabinet.
But he took all the southern states then.
He
right?
did.
Yeah.
Clean sweep. Clean sweep.
And thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
It was
It's wonderful that you all
wonderful.
came.
And thank you for coming. It's such a delight. You've made my day. I can
Yes,
see faces
great.
instead of my TV, my computer monitor.
You're right.